Hello and good morning. This is Christopher Zachary speaking, and I am discussing the question of, or the statement of, why bias is better than ignorance. I would be interested to know if this has some resonance with your lives professionally, either with the pharma industry or with the device companies, and we'll see where it goes. It's a fascinating subject of some relevance to us all. I have no disclosures, and there will be no off-label discussion during this presentation. So this was first presented at the American Academy of Dermatology meeting in 2013 at Miami. And the first thing I did was to ask the audience these questions. I have no bias, I have some or significant bias, and I don't know. And it was of interest that the great majority selected B. And it's of no surprise, really, because I do believe we all have some bias, but I was happy to see that I was speaking to an audience which had some significant understanding of the situation. So the theme of this presentation from Shakespeare's As You Like It: the fool doth think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool. And I think we've seen examples of this. And how does this apply to the question of bias and ignorance? Well, I personally have a tremendous sense of frustration with all the compliance issues which are so prevalent in clinical practice, in university practice. Even if you're in private practice, you have the same issues with the Joint Commission, with continuing medical education. There are constantly obstacles which are put in our way by state licensing boards, the ACCME, American Board of Medical Specialists, with regard to recertification, endless online classes. There's a lot of redundancy, which has a significantly negative impact on our ability to train residents and provide patient care. If we're spending 50% of our time in compliance issues, then we're not treating patients during this time. So anyway, the relevance here is that the AMA, the AAD, ASLMS, ASDS, and all the other professional organizations need to think about this very carefully, because I don't think we can just fall over every time some government organization tells us we need another set of compliance regulations thrust upon us. I think we should stand up to this and say enough is enough. So why is bias such a problem? And I acknowledge that bias is an issue. We're all subjected to a multitude of biased reporting, and this creates a lack of trust by patients, of physicians, and industry. It leads to questionable healthcare decisions made by us, we physicians. It induces us to use more expensive medications and devices, to do unnecessary investigations, studies, etc. So there was a very good presentation or paper actually in the New York Times in February this year, Doctors Who Don't Speak Out. I'd recommend you to look at this. And J&J is now paying the consequences for having ignored one of its own investigators who wrote to the company executives saying that the artificial hip sold by the company was hurting patients physically. There was a morbidity to this, and I hear the first case was just reported last week, and the jury found against J&J, and I think there was something like a $10 million settlement in that one case. Well, I believe there are something like 10,000 cases out there, so it's a big deal. There is a need for us all to protect the public. So I understand why bias is so important. There is a cost, however, to regulating against bias. Significant dollars and huge inconvenience for those of us who are educating for CME. I always say it's an irritating bother to have to comply with all these regulations, and it frankly makes us less inclined to want to provide continuing medical education. However, if bias causes us to prescribe dangerous drugs or use devices that are unsafe and ineffective, are we not contributing to the greater than 150,000 patients who die each year from drug and device complications? I think the answer is it's a big deal. So we have to take it seriously. So why is ignorance such a problem? Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge, says Charles Darwin, and Bertrand Russell, a very similar statement there. So we need to embrace all types of opinion. We need to embrace those experts who have a specific experience of a drug or device, because this adds value stemming from their intimate knowledge of the subject. Now, they're often biased because they're often the people who have done the studies. They're often the people who have spoken to the companies that are actually making the drugs or the devices. But however, we cannot ignore them. That we should listen to those with interactional expertise, those who know the language, the jargon, and the terms, but are not necessarily consultants with these companies. They add value in a different manner. They're less well informed usually, but they're less biased. And then there are those with popular understanding, or what we call a beer mat expertise. They probably they clearly add value. They're least biased. But we really need to consider this as a continuum of opinion. Each level of expert, so-called, has the potential to bring something valuable to the exchange, even if it's ignorance, because ignorance is okay. There's this concept of triangulation, of to bring all these three groups together for a common answer. So, what do you want from a lecture? That's the question. And indeed, I asked the packed audience at this was on the last day of the Academy meeting. I asked the audience, what do you want from a lecture? Do you want a review of all the devices and drugs available, with equal weight to all comers, good and bad, and you only want to hear about generic names? Or would you prefer to have a somewhat biased opinion, with opinionated ideas and thoughts, real biases, practical ideas from personal experience, using trade names with editorialized comments and so forth? Do you want to be given the chance to make up your own minds? And I will tell you that the overwhelming opinion in the audience was for the second option. I think there was one person who wanted to hear a review of all the devices. Now that to me is pure ignorance, which is crazy. You need a balance of all three. So there are many forms of bias. A person can be biased because of their background, their essential beliefs, their experience, loyalty to individuals or to companies, or indeed wishes for an outcome. If you've been working on a project for 5 or 10 years, there is a strong likelihood that you will have some opinion about how you would like this to come out, even though you might think that's not appropriate. There is always more fun to be had with a positive outcome than a negative one. The latter, by the way, is rarely published, unfortunately. There should be a journal for negative outcomes. Probably is, actually. So the American Academy of Dermatology, like many other academies, is dedicated to providing continuing medical education that's independent, fair, balanced, objective, and free of commercial bias. That is their main thing. They are very interested in commercial bias. I actually think that it's almost an impossible task, because most quality speakers have had some significant exposure or relationship at some time in their lives and careers with industry, and even without a continued commercial bias, there's a de facto emotional bias to that enduring emotional bias. Confirmational bias is something that's also very important, a tendency to favor information that confirms one's beliefs. There's a tendency to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting or supportive of an existing position, and they tend to strengthen personal beliefs in the face of contrary evidence. Think Colin Powell making that presentation to the United Nations before the invasion of Iraq. Think of the many poor military decisions that have been made, or even political decisions. There's a huge cost to being wrong, particularly all these kids coming back from Iraq, and even those who have been, or particularly those who have been injured, the tens of thousands of them. Huge cost to that confirmational bias process that went on during that time. So audience is biased by prevailing views. I remember at a meeting, the controversies and conversations in laser surgery, a meeting back in Bermuda, I think it was, about 15 years ago. A prominent laser surgeon was booed off the podium for saying any wavelength can be used to rejuvenate the skin. And at the time, it seemed pretty ridiculous. However, subsequently, it was established that she was absolutely correct. And there's the tragedy. Presentations with new concepts or those with pointed messages are often considered to be ridiculous or biased or incorrect. However, as an audience, because whether we're speaking or whether we're sitting down listening, we need an insightfulness, an open-mindedness. Obviously, there's need for skepticism, and we should avoid gullibility, but novelty is sometimes correct, and we have to think outside the box sometimes, or indeed allowing others to think out the box is very courageous on their part, and we should give them that privilege. So I asked the question, how would you rate the American Academy of Dermatology on conflict of interest? This comes from their website. The AAD operates best in a climate of trust, openness, and objective decision-making. Every individual is influenced by relationships that color opinions, behavior, and participation in group discussions and decision-making. The simple existence of a relationship is not categorically improper, etc., etc. I've just pulled these out of the website. Now, the problem with this last statement, the simple existence of a relationship is not categorically improper. What that implies is that the existence of a relationship probably is improper. They have to be very careful. All of us have to be careful with words. Words are so important. So, and they go on, conflicts of interest must be recognized, identified, and resolved, disclosure of all relationships with potential to bias judgment, etc., etc. Often, disclosure will protect the integrity of the situation, but disclosure may not suffice. So there's an understanding there, but in practice, as I say, I have concerns that most of our academies and educational groups are being pushed. They're between a rock and a hard place, and unfortunately it's the speakers and the audience who are in between the rock and the hard place. So what constitutes appropriate disclosure? This, for instance, might be a disclosure slide for somebody, but it means nothing. You have 20 names up there, and they're up for about 2 or 3 seconds. It means absolutely nothing. On the other hand, if you highlight the few names which are specifically associated with that lecture, that's a bit more helpful. And I'm not sure that we can actually do more than that. So at the Academy, what they tend to do is they assess bias largely by audience assessment. And if there's a concern about that, then they pre-screen selected talks prior to the presentation. Out of the 1,600 talks that were actually given this year, 21 were pre-screened, and 11 of those, more than 50%, were related to devices. The AAD considers devices of speakers who are associated with devices to have a greater incidence of bias. I'm not sure that's true at all, but actually there's only one way to determine bias, in my opinion, and that's actually to sit inside a lecture and listen to the nuance, the words, how things are being stated, etc. And who should assess these? Experts generally have some bias themselves, but on the other hand, untrained assessors, bright though they may be, it's probably going to be a useless exercise. It's very difficult to know how best to assess these. So there remains confusion on the part of the speakers, the audience, the reviewers, and indeed the leadership and administrative staff of the American Academy of Dermatology. And I would say they've only been partially successful, and I would have to give them a C- right now. What would make it better? As I say, I think there has to be triangulation. I think people have to understand that the lecturers who are best informed are probably those who have actually been associated with the studies, and I would allow the audience to make their own opinions, and I would ask the CME, the ACCME, to get off the back of the professional associations, because I don't think they're actually helping to provide good medical care for our patients. I will tell you that our residents, when they leave the programs, are often ignorant of many of the names of the current or new drugs because we're not allowed to talk about them. The pharmaceutical representatives are not allowed to visit the department, and it's really 3 steps backward as far as I'm concerned. So many conflicts of interest are actually personal and non-financial. Personal experience, for instance, I have had personal experience of bias amongst editors. Sad to say, I've seen it throughout my entire career, the last 30 years. And major reviewers of the journals, because of their entrenched views about which antigens are responsible for a particular disease, blistering disease, for instance, or dogma about lasers and lights, whether specifically about a particular wavelength or a particular pulse duration. There's often room for a little bit of discussion about this. But people's professional lives can be negatively impacted when biases are involved here. So bias, there's also a bias in selection of abstracts and speakers and absolutely grants, federal grants, etc. It depends what's in vogue and who's reviewing. So there's a lot of problems here, and let's all understand that it is complicated. So I take my hat off to the people who are trying to resolve this, but I don't think we have it right yet. And I can tell you that at this year's Academy, there were a lot of people who are upset at the way in which the Conflict of Interest Committee is trying to enforce stricter regulations. So when is a commercial bias resolved? You could say it's when in the presence of full disclosure for a presentation or a publication, it tends to remove many aspects which should be of concern to us. It doesn't tell us the whole story. That's true. And the audience, once informed, should be allowed to make up their own minds and simply should take the information into consideration, but not dismiss it out of hand. I think presentations and publications in the absence of full disclosure, this is a real problem. Particularly where money or similar is exchanged for influence, when information is massaged to suit the vendor, with or without intention to deceive. I believe it occurs, and I think it occurs frequently, and it's not just devices. I think there are drugs, and I think it happens in the American Academy of Dermatology and in every academy. I think it's fraudulent, and it's a total embarrassment, and there's a real need for consequences. So there is a problem here. I'm not being dismissive of this. I would just tell you that I got a letter last week, just prior to the Academy, saying, "Dear Dr. Zachary, I hope all is well with you. Mr. So-and-so asked me to send you slides for review. If appropriate, would you consider including so-and-so technology in your presentation at the Academy on Tuesday, the 5th of March at 11 a.m. on skin tightening? If acceptable, please send me your fee schedule. Thank you for your time and consideration. Kind regards." So, this is entirely appropriate, but if it happens to me, it happens to a lot of other people, where people at CME courses are offered money to include slides specifically and talk about specific products. This is totally unethical. We can't do this. So this is pretty black and white. There's no discussion about this. We can all understand this, but there are other aspects to bias which I think are less clear, which we also have to try to address. So then, how should we assess bias? Prevailing views will continue to dominate opinion. It's difficult to rely upon an audience with their prevailing views to assess bias. Slide review even by somebody who's very clever with some letters after the names, is almost worthless, because, as I say, it's all about the nuance of words, how the questions are framed. For instance, I would tell you that with regard to continuing medical education, if I asked the audience, as I did that Tuesday morning, do you want a bias-free talk? They'd say yes. But on the other hand, if I said, what about freedom of speech? Then they'd also say, yeah, we want freedom of speech. Depends how you ask the question. Gun control. Are you in favor of Second Amendment rights? Most people would say yes. Are you in favor of public safety? Oh, well, yes, we're in favor of that. So it just depends how the questions are asked. And I would say that the attendees need to be encouraged to ask the difficult questions from the floor. People are awfully polite in this country. I think it's about time they stood up, and if they disagreed with something, then they should strongly object to it. And it's important for us to discuss these questions, these serious questions from the floor in open discussion. So, what is my opinion about a relationship with industry? Well, I think collaboration should be encouraged, and indeed is encouraged at most academic institutions. It's instructive, it's synergistic, it's inventive. Tech transfer groups at any institution are very interested, and somehow an association with the university, if it goes through the university tech transfer group, it tends to absolve the taint of association. So I think it's probably healthy and necessary, and the universities these days need all the money they can get. It's also important for industry to rub shoulders with academia. There's a two-way street here. So if a person has a conflict of interest, should we listen to them? Well, I think we should listen to everybody. I think we have to be very careful not to exclude those with experience, those with dissenting views, and those with commercial bias. Obviously, we need to be guarded and streetwise. We need to be somewhat cynical, skeptical. For instance, if David Axelrod was on the Sunday morning talk show, he's going to give a biased presentation concerning the Obama administration. So, as I say, you have to be a bit streetwise here. All biased opinion should be excluded. This is being stated by various CME groups, and I would say if you exclude all biased opinion, there will be many fewer presentations and publications. Important for us not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should deal with it by triangulation and inclusion. Personally, I think regulation in general has gone way too far. That pendulum is swung so far that it's strangling our ability to be inventive, to give great medical care, and to do so in an environment which is going to be conducive to progress. I believe regulation has become an industry to itself. There's an inability to identify devices or drugs by trade names. That leaves the audience ignorant. It's harder and harder to stomach as these regulations become more stringent. We need middle ground here, and I would say that physician groups which appear to be powerless or unwilling to respond have got to stand up and say, no, too much, I've had enough. Otherwise, we're just going to be steamrolled over, and we will be less and less able to provide good education and good patient care. So finally, this was a great paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy by H. Shaw Warren, who had been trying for some time to get a paper published, and he had found evidence that the mouse model, which has been extensively used for analysis of three major killers, namely sepsis, burns, and trauma, is totally flawed. All right, and as a result, billions of dollars have been wasted following false leads where, for instance, something that might be resistant in a mouse is totally sensitive in a human, and vice versa. Just because something is going to kill a mouse doesn't mean to say it's going to have the same effect on the humans. I think oddly enough, I agree with some of the animal rights people here. I think we should start thinking about doing some more controlled, careful studies on humans where actual results can be have much more significance. So Many significant journal articles contain false or misleading information based on poor study techniques, and this poor chap, Shaw Warren, eventually got his information published in the proceedings. So congratulations to him, and congratulations to the Proceedings of the National Academy for actually publishing this material. Fraud and cheating has to go. We can't have it in the American Academy of Dermatology. We can't have it in medicine. But on the other hand, I think we have to have some sort of throttle on the controlling influence and private industry that has been created, which causes incredible pain and constipation within the educational services, so that we are restricted from saying what we think, from saying what we actually is true, what we believe. So with that, I would just hope that this raises some questions for you. I'd be happy to hear from you, either directly to my email, which is czachary@uci.edu, or at meetings to discuss this with you. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.